Good morning, everyone, and welcome, and thanks for attending. We are going to be spending 4 hours this morning talking about campaign finance, First Amendment, Colorado law, and a case law update. And so we're really excited about this agenda. We're doing this under a bill that was passed last year in the legislature that the Secretary of State will put on 4 hours of campaign finance, continuing legal education every year. And so we're going to be offering this on a yearly basis, probably around this same time. And then we're going to post this video or audio up on the website of the Secretary of State's office for anybody to view, and the accreditation forms are in the back, or that'll be listed on the Supreme Court website if you want to sign up and get accreditation for this. The first thing on our agenda this morning is going to be kind of a campaign finance 101, and that's going to be done by Scott Gassler. And Scott is our former Secretary of State, and prior to that he was a campaign attorney, finance attorney, elections attorney, former business owner, and he currently teaches a class on elections at the University of Denver. So I will turn it over to Scott. Would you rather have a PowerPoint?
That'd be great.
Where do we put that?
All right, well, do I need that for the audio? I can't just yell.
Well, what?
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces. So I'm just going to do a little bit of an overview on the campaign finance law. And some of you have heard this repeatedly, so please don't yawn for those in the office in the back. But this is sort of the way I tend to look at, from the structural standpoint, campaign finance laws. And I use sort of a handy 3x3 matrix, which is good for all that ails you. So if you're looking at campaign finance, and this isn't obviously not perfect, but as a general matter, there are sort of 3 types of behavior that are regulated. So you got contributions, and that's basically whenever you give money or receive money involved in the political world. And that can also, we can quibble about what that means as well. We can argue about that, because sometimes it's not money, it's a thing of value that's coordinated with the candidate, but that's contributions, okay? And then you have express advocacy, okay? So express advocacy is when you engage in a communication, a public communication, and you expressly advocate the support or defeat of a candidate. So vote for, vote against, support, oppose. And we can have arguments about what constitutes express advocacy, but as a general category, that's fairly well defined. And then you have electioneering communications. And electioneering communications are an unambiguous reference to a candidate made 60 days before a general, 30 days before a primary, that is targeted to the population of voters for that particular candidate. So that would be an electioneering communication. So of course the most famous example is the Bill Yellowtail ad, which basically sort of says, this guy running for Congress, beats his wife, kicks his dog, dodged his taxes, is a terrible person. Call him and tell him that he's a terrible person. Never says vote for or vote against, so it's not express advocacy. It's an electioneering communication because that was made just prior to an election, targeted to the appropriate audience, and on the federal side you have to spend a certain level of money before you have to report it. Well, same on the state side. So these are sort of the 3 areas of behavior that campaign finance regulates. Now, there's a couple outside of this that we'll talk about, but this is a pretty good framework. And then there's 3 ways that they're regulated. There's 3 ways that they're regulated. So first you have dollar limits, okay? And that's, how much you can give, how much you can't give. So to a legislative candidate, you can give $200 per election. which means $200 for a primary election, $200 for a general election. So $400 combined. The legislature passed a statute so that you can give that full $400 either before the primary or the full $400 after the primary. And the candidate can spend that full $400. That's a little bit different than the federal law where you actually have to segregate the primary and general money. You know, unless you're a small donor committee, in which case, I don't know if the contribution limits, with the inflation limits, it's a little bit over $4,000 that a small donor committee can give to a legislative candidate, and so on. So each candidate has a contribution dollar limit. Political committees have dollar limits, the whole schmear. Okay, so you have dollar limits, how much you can give. Then the next item, the way it's restricted, is source restrictions. Okay, and that's who can do something. You know, who can make the contribution, who can engage in the express advocacy, or what the source of the money is coming from. Okay, so then you have source restrictions. And then finally you have, of course, disclosure. And disclosure comes in two forms. One form is reports to the Secretary of State. Okay, Secretary of State reports. And the other form of disclosure is disclaimers, or maybe better stated, claimers. So that's if there's a radio ad or a TV ad or a mail piece paid for by so-and-so, if it's an outside organization, paid for by so-and-so, not authorized by any candidate or candidate committee. So you've got the disclaimers we'll put, I'll put the dis in front of the disclaimers. Now, this isn't perfect, okay? So for example, Colorado regulates political organizations as defined by the IRS. Okay, so the IRS, under section 527 of the IRS code, says if you are trying to influence an election, the election, selection, nomination of a candidate, you are a 527. And if you're 527, you can give money to these 527 organizations that have this tax designation and not have to pay taxes. So that's sort of like a tax safe harbor. And it's a self-designation in this very broad category. It's very easy to designate yourself a 527. Well, what Colorado has done is they said, well, if you designate yourself from the tax standpoint that way, from a tax standpoint, you are also regulated under our state campaign finance laws. So conceivably, you could add another column here for political organizations, if you're a political organization. In other words, if you seek a certain tax designation for your funding, then you also have to disclose, or you also have regulations under state law. Okay, so you can sort of add that category. That's a little bit lighter. It's not analyzed quite as much, but that's sort of an example. Now, when you look at this, the line between contributions and everything else to the right is a sometimes fuzzy line. And one of the things I always think about campaign finance like it's just full of fuzziness. There's like all kinds of fuzziness in campaign finance law. In fact, I would argue that campaign finance law in Colorado is a mess. Not just a mess, a hot mess. It's very difficult. And here's sort of one of the examples, for example. So what constitutes a contribution? Well, obviously, if I give someone money for their campaign, that's pretty easily measured as a contribution. You know how much money it is, and you've given it. Well, what if, and this is sort of the classic example, a candidate doesn't have enough money, which in Colorado happens all the time because the contribution limits are so low. And what if the candidate says to me, hey, I don't have any money to do something like this. Would you be kind enough to send a mail piece talking about how wonderful I am to the demographic of women between ages 25 and 55 that are targeted at this particular area in Republican and split Republican and unaffiliated households? Could you do that for me? And I would say, yes, of course I'll do that. So I go off and I do it. That would be considered a contribution to the candidate because it's done at the request or suggestion of a candidate. Okay? Now, federal law has a pretty extensive definition as to what constitutes contribution. And that's oftentimes been, not oftentimes, it still is, and sort of an ongoing source of controversy. And I tend to use that as at least a sense, a framework for even applying state law. State law has a different definition that incorporates elements of the federal definition. The federal definition is several pages long. It's a three-part test. It's gone through, I think, about 6, and this is not exaggerated, 6 or 7 rounds of litigation on the federal level. I mean, it has been a heavily, heavily litigated regulation as to what constitutes coordination with a candidate. So, in the federal side, you have a conduct prong, you have a content prong. Only certain types of content can be coordinated. In state law, some of that is incorporated, but not all of it. And state law is a little bit fuzzier of a definition, and it's not quite as well defined. I think it's fair to say. It's also a little bit easier to understand, so you sort of have that trade-off, a little bit more vagueness than the precision, but that in part stems from our Constitution. So, so this line can sometimes be really fuzzy, and this line isn't just between express advocacy and contributions. This line is between anything off to the right and what a contribution is. Okay, so so those can sometimes be challenges. Dollar limits is generally pretty straightforward, how much you can give. And the answers to that are, for contributions, if you're a candidate or a political committee or a small donor committee, you have very definitive contribution limits. So when I ran for statewide office last cycle, it was $1,050 to a statewide. Well, my first time was $1,050, inflation kicked in. Second time was $1,100. That was $550 for the primary, $550 for the general. Pretty straightforward what that is. If you are an independent organization, all right, and there are certain types, an independent expenditure committee is an organization that supports or opposes candidates. It does express advocacy right down the line, but it never makes contributions to candidates. Never, never, never. Okay, so if you're that type of independent expenditure committee, you have unlimited contribution limits. All right, Citizens United basically targeted these squares here. In the past, under Colorado law, you could not, corporations and labor unions could not give money. But now there are no source restrictions. Well, I shouldn't say none. You do have federal law that prohibits foreigners from contributing, okay? So to a large extent, it's very open, very few source restrictions. And of course, you have lots of disclosure requirements for an independent expenditure committee that's engaging in express advocacy only, okay? If you're a political committee, so you can look at each one of these types of committees, a political committee, that by definition, you make contributions to candidates, okay? You can contribute the normal amount. So you have a contribution limit, and you have a contribution incoming limit as well. The amount of money you can receive is limited to, I think, was it $525 or $550 for a political committee contribution limit? $525. Okay, so with inflation over the last $575, I thought it was a little higher. All right, so it just went up, didn't it? All right, so it just went up. So now it's $575 that a political committee can receive. There are no source restrictions or limited ones. Again, no foreigners. Well, corporations and labor unions can contribute to a political committee. And then there's lots of disclosure requirements. Okay? We used to have organizations that just did electioneering communications. Okay? And the reason why is because a corporation could fund an electioneering communication under state law. Now we don't have to worry about corporations funding express advocacy, so most people don't limit themselves just to electioneering communications. They'll focus on express advocacy, because it's usually more efficient to say, vote for, vote against, than to hint around at it. All right? So you don't really have, at least lately in Colorado, as many organizations. But you could have an organization that just does electioneering communications, in which case, no dollar limits coming in, okay? You'd have no source restrictions, except for foreigners again. And you'd have lots of disclosure requirements. for someone that just did electioneering communications. Political organizations, no source limitation, no contribution limits, no source restrictions, but disclosure requirements as well, and those take two forms. So this is generally a pretty good way to sort of look at where does an issue lie, where does a case lie. So let's take Citizens United, something that's received lots of press since it was decided. Citizens United decided sort of two issues within this box. There was an organization called Citizens United that was engaging in electioneering communications at the time. And they were a corporation, and they said, we get to do this. Well, the court ultimately said, with respect to source restrictions, yes, you can do this, and you can't prohibit corporations from doing this, and you can't prohibit corporations from doing this. So you can do that. So this is what Citizens United did. Corporations still, those source restrictions still exist for contributions, but not for independent type of behavior that's outside of the contribution line. Well, then Citizens United also, though, upheld lots of disclosure requirements. So when you look at these three categories, that's sort of the way to look at it. But let me talk just about a couple other things for sort of this little introductory, and then Ed Ring is going to come up and we'll chat a little bit about the First Amendment implications. So why does campaign finance law exist? All right, I'm not going to talk about the political, we'll talk about the legal side. And the purpose of campaign finance law from the state standpoint is to prevent corruption in the appearance of corruption. So there's two things, the corruption and the appearance of corruption. That's for generally contribution limits. Does anyone want me to keep this up anymore, or can I get rid of it? Hearing no concerns one way or the other. It is going. Okay, so when it comes to the world of campaign finance law, corruption and the appearance of corruption. So to think about that, we have spending, okay, and that constitutes, in my little chart earlier, would have been these two categories: express advocacy and electioneering communications. How you spend money. And then you have contributions, okay, and then you have disclosure. Okay? Again, those are sort of our three, those are categories of how the court looks at this stuff. So corruption and the appearance of corruption. One of the important things about the Citizens United case is it said corruption consists of quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. So prior to that, there's another case, Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce versus Austin, which said, large war chests, aggregated wealth, that corrupts the system. Citizens United rejected that framework and said corruption is quid pro quo. And most would argue, including me, that returns to the Buckley framework. Some say, no, Buckley allowed this aggregation of wealth. But today, the state of the law is quid pro quo corruption. Spending, if it's independent, in other words, on that side of that fuzzy line, does not corrupt people because there's no quid pro quo. There's no quid. I'm not giving money to